Cool. Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Umang, for a fantastic opening. It's a nice compliment, I think, to my session because my session is going to be all about technology. So it's very interesting that he said, okay, the technology is an enabler, which I completely agree with. So let's start by asking a simple question, which is, what if I asked every one of you at your organization, or in fact, not just ask, in fact, if I told you that your organization or your teams are extremely efficient, what would you think about it? I said your teams and your organizations are extremely efficient. You would think that, well, it's a compliment. So you would take it as a compliment. But being efficient is only effective if you're dealing with a very stable and a hardly changing environment. So if your environment is rapidly changing, if you're navigating a completely volatile, uncertain environment, it's not efficiency that matters. What matters is our ability to adapt to these changing circumstances. And in fact, this is exactly why APIs are paramount to business success, because APIs help organizations adapt to these uncertain and rapidly changing environments. In many ways, what I've found through our Gartner interactions is that there's a seemingly interesting virtuous cycle between APIs and adaptability. Because what this means is, what APIs does is that it enables organizations to become adaptive, and at the same time, that increased adaptability fuels the growth of more relevant and contextually relevant APIs. So if you look at, let's say, for instance, how our own industry has transitioned. So we went from delivering packaged business applications. So in the old days, you would easily have encountered this scenario where if you were, let's say, receiving applications, if you're working with an outsourced partner, you'd have your outsourcing system integrators, you'd have technology people. So if you're dealing with maybe the likes of SAP, you're dealing with Oracle, right? You'd have all of these packaged business applications which worked like standalone applications. In many cases, the idea was these applications were intended to be fully fledged, right? So it was almost a given that your applications, when you buy them, they would work as intended for the purpose that you're buying for. But increasingly, this has turned out to be less effective when you're faced with a scenario where applications don't have to change, right? So the whole idea of agile digital transformation means you don't plan for years in advance. So you're really expecting what is called packaged business capabilities and not packaged business applications. So with packaged business capabilities, you end up with delivering business capabilities as if they're API products that you see here. So in many cases, this has been a very, very interesting transition in how APIs are positioned. Historically, right, APIs were dealt as if it's sort of, okay, here's an API for what you can accomplish. So in fact, when the iPhone came out, we almost said there's an app for that, but it sort of evolved to say, okay, now there's an API for that. But the big transition we are seeing now in the industry is that we are starting to treat business capabilities as if they're APIs product, but APIs themselves as being product. Now, what's important with API products are two things, right? One is we treat APIs as a product, which means products have a life cycle, products have customers, products evolve, products will have a roadmap. Now, all of this means that, in fact, like any other product, if we start treating APIs as a product, what we will really need is to have API product managers. This has been another interesting find for us, and which we don't see as commonly as we would like to, which is for successful API product management, what we really need are API product managers. And maybe just ask for a show of hands, if as long as you're not a technology provider. So in your organization, and if you're managing APIs, if you're providing APIs, how many of these APIs product teams actually are run by product managers? Do you treat API product management as a discipline, right? It's actually very few, but I'm pretty sure in most cases, what you will want to see is API product managers are pivotal to API success. And the reason is that these product managers are dealing with two kinds of customers, right? So it's a very distinctive place with APIs as products is very different from any other kind of product. And the reason is with API products, you have two kinds of customers. One who are internal customers who are basically, if you have developers who are actually building APIs that you provide to the external world, for API product management, they are a customer. These are API producers, right? They basically create APIs as products. On the other hand, you have developers who are consumers of your API, right? So product managers are important because they act as a liaison between your internal application developers who produce these APIs, and then you have API consumers who consume APIs, but to solve a problem. So in many cases, if you don't have a product manager, you almost end up with a product which has no roadmap. You can hardly iterate on these APIs. Consumers who provide feedback, they might feel then their feedback is not being incorporated, right? So you almost end up with a stagnant API, and it doesn't really get the respect of being treated as a product. In many cases, I would also say that in addition to having a product manager, you should consider having a developer relations person. So we are increasingly saying, obviously, if you have been tracking the movement online, there's lots of interest in having roles like, for instance, a DevRel person, right? So this is both, by the way, for evangelizing APIs internally within your organization, but also externally with your API consumers. This is one of my favorites, which is if you think about what the future of API products will be, and the title says it, right? And I'll clarify what I mean by this. API products will be bought by API customers. This is a little different than API consumers, right? So let's look at what the state of the current API industry is. So obviously we have lots of banks who provide APIs as products. Umang just mentioned that you might have maybe the likes of Standard Chartered, you might have DBS in Singapore, right? Lots of banks in Indonesia, Southeast Asia has lots of local banks as well as multinational banks who have a presence here. Now, all of these banks offer API products. But then if you look at a few more examples, whether it is Deutsche Bank and the classic examples of Stripe, right, which are well-known examples of API products being used by millions of developers, hundreds of thousands of companies. What will be interesting is when you start looking at when machines become customers, that is, you no longer have humans consuming these APIs, but you end up having machine customers. In fact, two of my colleagues, Don Shabendrive and Mark Restino, wrote this recent book, which is when machines become customers, this is going to profoundly change how we consume different APIs. The world we live in will not necessarily be targeting people, right? So today you might really be thinking about targeting, let's say, having personalized ads. You might have customized ads. But in future, when your printer starts ordering paper for itself, and today that is already a reality, right? So you have printers who are printers that are actually ordering cartridges. You have coffee machines which are sort of self-serving themselves. Cars that could in future, right, service themselves, order tires. What ends up happening is when machines become customers, you will have API customers for your API product, right? So in general, that's sort of the future of how it's not just important for us to have API products, but also imagine a future where you'll have API customers, which are APIs themselves, sort of self-serving their needs. This leads to maybe a bigger question, which is, if you're a large organization, like for instance, MasterCard, you might have Visa, right? Large organizations. What we've really seen is there's an increasing need for creating what we call API platform teams. Because if you think about, let's say, a small organization, in a small organization, you have this you build it, you run it, you own it mindset, which is okay if you're building one API, right? So you could have one single team that owns it all end to end, including the tooling that's used to build those APIs. But as you progress from a single team where you have just one API to multiple APIs, you soon reach a state where you're not just dealing with one API as a product or a couple of APIs as a product, But in general, you will have multiple teams that you have to enable, right? And very soon you need to literally think about empowering, right, as well as enabling all of the product teams that are building all of these APIs. So what this really means is that there is a need for a platform team construct which serves the need of multiple product teams. And these are multiple API product teams. Because in general, there is this whole idea of standards paradox, right? Which is if there's this conflict between autonomy and standards, which is in many ways you can think of, I'll put it very paradoxically, that standards actually create a lot of autonomy. Think about it for a minute. So increased standardization does not necessarily mean that development teams don't have autonomy. Done the right way, what you're really standardizing is all of the undifferentiated work that the teams might rather not do, right? So if you think about an example, so for instance, even if you're an API developer, you would not be really interested in managing API management tools themselves, right? You would not be concerned about managing Jenkins, for instance, version control repositories, testing tools. You're not concerned about patching. You would rather sort of not necessarily outsource, but rather, have teams that specialize in these undifferentiated work. So that's what's coming to be called, enabling teams or platform teams. What we're really trying to do with platform teams are three things. First, let's look at what problems the platform team solves. Right? First is every organization needs to create their own API strategy. But if you have 20 different products, you can't expect 20 different API strategies, right? You need platform teams to own and implement that API strategy. Second, you'll also need platform teams that own API infrastructure. That's essentially API platform infrastructure. And what you also need are teams that think about building a platform ecosystem. And this really is both internal platform ecosystems where you're building APIs and creating an internal platform ecosystem. I'll take an example of which company actually succeeded with this, as well as a company that builds a digital platform ecosystem for external customers. So if you're looking at the first requirement, which is it's about creating and implementing an API strategy. I'm pretty sure like all of you are wondering, what constitutes API strategy, right? What are the dimensions of an API strategy? What we have listed here are 5 critical dimensions of an API strategy. First one, in no particular order, because all of them are equally important, you might want to think about, let's say, starting, taking a cue from where Umang left off, right? Establishing business alignment. Business alignment, that is having technology teams that focus on creating APIs, aligning what the APIs offer and making them, align with what the business needs to accomplish. Because ultimately, right, every business has external consumers. So making sure there is alignment between internal IT teams as well as internal business teams, that's important. And in fact, as you move from, let's say, project orientation to a product-based construct, you'll naturally sort of accomplish this alignment. That's in fact, one of the core principles of why we need product teams, because product teams inherently have this alignment with business, unlike technology-focused project teams. Another element of an API strategy is API lifecycle management. That is, we said, if APIs are products, we need to really think about how to manage their life cycle, right? They really start with being conceived as being it's basically, APIs start off saying, okay, here's what the customer wants. And it goes through a life cycle saying, we build the APIs, we have to test it, we have to secure, deliver, version control it. And in fact, in many cases, even think of retiring and deprecating those APIs. Increasingly, what we also find is developer enablement. So, there's also this balance between governance and developer experience, right? So in fact, if you think about one big problem that API teams solve is, I mentioned there is an interesting paradox where standardization can actually help with increased autonomy. What I mean is, think about adaptive governance, right? So what is being shown here is how if you have platform teams, if you have API platform teams, then these platform teams can actually focus on, one, improving developer experience, that is, developer experience for your internal teams, but also external API consumers, right? So they focus on developer experience, because in many cases, what we're seeing is developer experience and their success ultimately leads to business success. Not to mention that in most of these organizations, because you'll be working in, let's say, regulatory environments, there's a need for governance, but it's not governance in the form of command and control. So this is adaptive governance, where you might say there might be elements where you could let's say, for instance, in the security world, right? You're putting in guardrails, but the guardrails are not designed as blockers, but you're really embedding those guardrails as a part of the platform itself. All of the examples that you see here. So John likes to use this terminology that we're living in a multi-world, right? So you're looking at multiple cloud architectures. You have multiple cloud providers. You have multiple DevOps platforms. Heck, you also have multiple API management platforms themselves. It's hard to conceive that any organization today will just standardize on one API gateway, one API portal, or one API management tool, right? So when you're faced with this scenario where you're living in this multi-world, you really need adaptive governance of making sure that you strike a right balance between what the organization wants to accomplish from a compliance perspective, as well as what the developers need from an experience perspective. So what I'm just showing here is the second responsibility of the platform team, which is about managing API platform infrastructure, right? So this is not a reference architecture, but it does a good job of, for instance, painting a picture of what are those different elements. So you'll have API management, there are API portals, API gateways. But guess what? You can't leave all of these tooling, all of the platform responsibilities down to the API development teams themselves, right? So somebody needs to subsume this responsibility, and that falls on API platforms. In many cases, I think interestingly what you'll see is this is more of a separation of concerns. This is subsuming cross-cutting concerns and letting what platform teams do best, owning all of the API platform infrastructure. In fact, there's another interesting trend. I don't think I'll get time to discuss it in detail, but happy to chat after this session, which is the idea of unbundling API management, right? So I wouldn't go as far as a recent blog post that said API lifecycle management is dead, right? Because people like to have these clickbaity titles where you might really say, okay, DevOps is dead or API lifecycle management is dead. But it's more interesting to think in terms of how you can sort of triangulate API management and unbundle API management capabilities. And the reason I say that is if you think about what you get once you triangulate API management and unbundle one component, it's API portals, right? So API portals, API gateways, in many cases, all of these are they're constructs, they're entities that are emerging when you start unbundling and unpackaging these huge suite offerings, which are API lifecycle management. I think the core essence of why we are talking about unbundling API management is not fundamentally that API management has flaws or weaknesses. The reason we are saying that is that in many cases, if you think about it, APIs themselves are software applications, they're software products, right? But in many organizations, you have a set of processes, a set of workflows, a set of tools that you'd use to build your other applications, and you have a completely siloed set of tools, processes, workflows for APIs, which are done using API management. And so there is this there's this acknowledgement that API management is not necessarily following all of the agile practices that are now being applied to other tools. For instance, how many times have we seen version control, right? Or being applied to APIs, or if you think about testing mechanisms, API security testing, API management, all of those things end up becoming a silo, and that's the reason why people are starting to unbundle API management and make them an integral part of the broader DevOps lifecycle. So what you see here is one flavor of API portals, but I think the bigger use case that we found was that let's take a real world example. Now this is going to the third piece, right, which is basically saying how can API platform teams actually help create a platform ecosystem, right? And Nike as an example, it's a classic example because what we saw was, let's say when COVID started, almost all stores shut down almost immediately, right? So you had the likes of Adidas, you had the likes of Nike, all of them selling sneakers, for instance, through online channels. And this had, in many cases, right, many of these companies, whether it's not just shoe companies, right? So it could be retailers, in general, even grocery stores, they were not prepared for this. What they really quickly realized was that what hinders like digital acceleration in many of these companies, you might think that Nike, well, is sort of a digital leader, right? So, but if you have to uh, move a notch up, you'll find that a lot of these organizations have accumulated lots of technical debt. In many cases, they have spaghetti architecture. It's, if you have to build a new product from scratch, it's not that easy, right? Because it doesn't lend itself to a composable architecture. You can't compose products from existing building blocks. So what you see here is an example of how Nike's internal platform ecosystem looks. It hardly looks like an ecosystem, right? So this is a spaghetti of multiple sort of APIs being reused, right? It's even, in fact, one of the bullets says that it was very hard for even internal product teams to discover existing technology and even innovate faster. So all of these become blockers. So what they ended up doing was creating an internal platform ecosystem of composable platforms. So you had about, let's say, if you think about this, right, you move from a spaghetti architecture to more of a lasagna type architecture, which is, in many cases, you might want to say, well, if you're building a platform ecosystem, what kind of platforms would we need, right? So you might say, well, every platform needs to abstract away the underlying complexity of the platform that it's abstracting, making the very sort of definition of a platform, right? So you're abstracting, you're hiding unnecessary complexity, but it's not just platforms as in infrastructure platforms, right? So what Nike did was they identified, if we have to build applications that are end user facing really quickly, then there are three kinds of platforms that we'll need to create. One example of those platforms are foundational platforms. So foundational platforms would be, these are capabilities or services which provide data, because Nike fundamentally is, they view themselves as a data and analytics company that just happens to manufacture shoes, right? So it's sort of that profound, which is, you then start to look at foundational platforms that expose reusable services to core platforms, and core platforms then expose, a further set of reusable services for experience platforms. I thought of this as a very interesting interplay of different platforms. What you can see here is, even though there are 85 different platforms, they have a nice tiered architecture where you can say, if I have to build a new experience, for instance, there's generative AI. Now, I don't have to really worry about core platforms that underpin that new experience. I can plug into the existing core platforms. And if you're building a new core platform, you can always say, well, I have foundational platforms that I can tap into. Another example is Wacom. So Wacom, is a digital insurer in France. I can't see Mehdi in the room, but is obviously very close to this. It's one of the largest insurance companies in Europe. And if you think about the big shift that they went through is, they cease to look at themselves as an insurance company. Right? So Wacom today thinks of themselves as being a digital company that just happens to do business in insurance. So as a huge sort of testament to this is, they have now scaled to about 400 partnerships, right? You can think of, what Wacom does is so interesting, which is they allow their partners to embed insurance, right? So they provide white labeled insurance. And what this leads to is essentially saying that if you are sort of an insurance self-service provider, if you're providing white labeled insurance products, you might get a partner, let's say, for instance, in this case, maybe a dealer, a new fintech, anybody who's trying to augment their own service with, insurance underwriting, they might come to Wacom and say, you have all of the insurance infrastructure. Can you provide this new service for us? But guess what happens, right? Wacom now has to create a new solution in a matter of weeks. Have you ever considered, building an insurance product in weeks? It takes years to build an insurance product. Now, Wacom, because they created this ecosystem around APIs, and this was enabled by their own internal API platform team, they're able to scale and onboard in fact, multiple partners per week. So we know for a fact that they're onboarding about 4 to 6 partners every week, and in total they have about 400 partnerships. So they went, as you can see on the slide here on the right. So they went from being like a 50 million turnover company to about 450 million in a couple of years, and this is unthinkable in the regulated space. So this, in summary, highlights the importance of having platform teams. So 3 things, right? We discussed, which is about implementing API strategy, right? Which is also looking at abstracting away API platform infrastructure, and finally, you can think about looking at API platform ecosystem. I know I'm running short, but I'll skip to the portions where we'll not look through all of the surveys that I would love to, but really look at, let's say, because as you know, Gartner is a company that focuses a lot on what are the emerging trends. So what top technology trends will impact API development and API consumption? So a few that I'd really like your attention to, which is in many ways, these would fundamentally impact how APIs are going to be developed, but also how they're going to be consumed. So the first one is not necessarily because it's the flavor of the day, right? Is generative AI. So generative AI, not merely in the form of ChatGPT, for instance, generative AI is impacting not just, by the way, API development, it's impacting all of software development, right? So in fact, we like to think that it's one of those technologies that has an influence on every step of the development lifecycle, all the way from design to coding to testing to securing, and in fact, getting customer feedback, right? So generative AI is big. Another big trend is supply chain security. And I cover security in great depth. And one of the things that really saddens me is that APIs are not viewed as an integral part of the software supply chain security problem. Most people think it's just open source software that we directly use. But remember that APIs also form an extended part of your software supply chain. So software supply chain security and all of the innovations happening in that space will apply equally to API development and will safeguard API consumers. API observability is big. And in fact, there's another interesting insight here, which is if you're tracking observability space, especially I know I was taking a walk around the booth. We have the likes of New Relic here, right? And you might see that there is this convergence happening between observability and security, right? We've seen this happen in other domains like network monitoring and network security came together. We'll start to see this convergence of API security and API observability. Right? Green software engineering is big. And if you think about, let's say, just yesterday we had an entire track dedicated to sustainability. I like to think of green software engineering, something to the effect of sustainability-driven development, right? So anytime you're building APIs, not just ask, right? Are we building it correctly, but also are we building the right thing, right? The other thing to think about is also, much like we have test-driven development, much like we have observability-driven development, do think of practices like sustainability-driven development, right? It's not an afterthought, but it's really how sustainability can drive your development practices. The last two are interrelated, which is platform engineering and developer experience, which is, we just saw the importance of what it means to have a platform and the influence it can have on improved developer experience, both for internal developers as well as external developers. So finally, like any classic Gartner presentation, I'd like to leave you with a few recommendations and key takeaways, right? Which is obviously don't create governance bottlenecks, right? Adopt API product management. But some of the things, I mean, this could have easily gone for a couple hours, right? I'm pretty sure all of you know this is a big topic. But the big one is APIs are not all REST anymore. So do pay attention to maybe the likes of GraphQL, looking at event-driven APIs, APIs as SaaS applications, and so on. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation. I'll be here for any questions. Thank you.